Bullwhips and Ninetails. The sun rained on high and offered Billings, Massachusetts, no quarter. It parched soil, withered cornstalks, and buckled the July morning with heat waves. Todd Alden roasted on the back seat of his father's 1965 Ford Fairlane. Even with the windows open, the car felt like an oven left to air. Todd stretched out his legs, but his toes could not reach the floor. They dangled and bounced off the dog's haunches as the car drove along Pleasant Street toward Plymouth and Route 6. The moon landing was scheduled for the following day, and Todd's parents had arranged a barbecue to celebrate the occasion. The child sat on his father's knee 3 days earlier when the rocket launched. He was excited by the prospect of watching the landing with Uncle Perry and Auntie Alice. They weren't real family, but they had been close friends with his mother and father forever. Sunday had been reserved for the Apollo 11 landing, but Saturday remained available for the family to do as they pleased. A day at the beach proved the most popular idea, and the two Alden boys were bundled onto the back seat of the car with the dog. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. Heat haze rippled the air over the recently tarred stretch of road, and a sharp blue sky touched dry lawns, high pines, and red brick chimneys. People turned on sprinklers or carried trash bags to the ends of driveways. Todd spied Fred, the garbage man, and waved to him through the rear window. Fred Deggery was a large, heavy-set man who dressed in green overalls most days. Handprints mottled the canvas material or stretched like lanes of traffic along his legs. His hair was greased back the way a CIA agent might style it. He waved to the boys as the family's car sped past. Nancy tapped Tom's shoulder and observed it was a shame Fred's boy turned out like that. "Epilepsy's such a, tricky business." Todd wriggled next to Sammy and said,
"Dick Brewster says Elias is waiting for a flood."
"Oh, those Brewster boys," Nancy growled. "Don't listen to anything Dick says. He's a goddamn shitheel." "Oh, honey," Tom said. "Don't you honey me." She turned around to see Todd better. "Were Elias's pants too short?" she asked. Todd giggled. "Mm-hmm. Elias's father's a hard-working man. He can't make enough money to buy new things. The Brewsters have lots of money. They don't have to go to the Salvation Army store for clothes." The sun sparkled through the trees at Todd. He was distracted for a moment, as if the great ball of fire was playing hide-and-seek. "It's not nice to bully someone for being different," Tom said. Todd wriggled where he had been squeezed in between his brother Pete and the dog on the back seat of the car. The Fairlane still smelled new because his father cared for it so meticulously. Tom Alden polished the upholstery and washed the car by hand 2 or 3 times a week in summer. He applied turtle wax and buffed the metalwork until it shined. "I hate these long drives," Nancy sighed. "Could have gone to Plymouth," Tom said. "No, you're right. Would have been so busy." It was a half-an-hour drive from Billings, Massachusetts to the town of Sandwich. Tom chose it as the location for their family outing because they could have breakfast there before heading to Sandy Neck Beach. White sand stretched all the way from Sandwich to Barnstable, and much of its 6 miles remained quiet even at the height of season. The terns who nested in the dunes acted as a natural deterrent to some visitors. The territoriality of these small birds was vicious and determined. They had red beaks and a sleek design. Their screeches and clicks warned visitors they would dive-bomb anyone who dared to spread a towel on their patch. Nancy looked at her sons and the dog in the rear-view mirror. She was no doubt pleased the boys had such a large companion. Sammy was a grand-looking animal. He was hardy and robust and never had a single visit to the vet, unlike his purebred cousins. She loved the old mutt as much as her kids and was happy to admit it. The dog had been part of the family for years, and the boys loved him. His gentleness around children did not stop him being fierce if he needed to protect them. "I ever tell you how we got Sammy?" Nancy asked. Todd scrunched up his features and said,
Uncle Perry left the barn door open, and Henry broke in.
Nancy turned around and studied him.
That's right, she said. Uncle Perry must have gone on one of his wanders. He's weird, Pete said. He's not always, with it, Tom said. He had an unhappy life. Anyway, Nancy said, Alice is a snob and thought the puppies were spoiled. You mean like Dottie? No, Nancy said. Her daughter's another thing altogether. That girl's a bit stuck up for a 6-year-old, if you ask me, Tom said. This is about the dog, Nancy snapped. And keep your eyes on the road. She breathed in the humid air. He was the sweetest puppy I ever saw. He plunked down next to you, she tickled Todd's legs, and chose you. Tom Alden turned the car onto Route 6. The unrelenting sun burnt dirt from the windscreen and puffed it up in dissipating clouds. Humidity sat on Massachusetts with a slow, ample weight and made the state yearn for a sea breeze or a storm. The dog leaned his head out the window so his chops flapped like laundry in a breeze. Todd and Pete sat on the back seat and giggled at the noises the Dane made. They were 5 and 9 years old, and their faces shined with the prospect of an adventure. Did you know, Tom called to the boys, this used to be called the Old King's Road. The Old King's Highway, Nancy said. Her correction stifled any further discussion. Nancy always had her head buried in a textbook, a high-browed periodical, or a novel, whereas Tom invariably found himself drawn to the funny pages of the Boston Globe. Her education was largely self-taught, but she was bright and up on the issues of the day. He could not compete with her and had given up trying. She smiled at him and lit a cigarette. The smoke wafted back over the boys. Todd appreciated the smell and smiled as he inhaled it. For reasons he could not understand, the scent comforted him. Perhaps he associated it with the calm which settled whenever his parents approached anything resembling an argument. They would share a smoke, and this would diffuse any tension and settle them back into a state of matrimonial ease. It was originally a native trail, Nancy said. She took a drag on the cigarette and passed it to Tom. You mean Indians? Todd asked. His eyes widened with the thought of braves carrying tomahawks, their feet in soft moccasins and their hair fashioned into mohawks. Yes, Nancy said. Then the Puritans arrived and stole it. Claimed it for king and goddamn country, and we've been abusing them ever since. Tom pulled in a heft of smoke. Your mother's right about the Indians. He passed the cigarette back. Of course, President Nixon's looking to improve things for them. Nancy glared at her husband. That son of a bitch is using them as a smokescreen. She flicked ash into the tray and stubbed out the cigarette. Only a fool would take anything that meant. I'm no fool, Tom snapped. It was too soon to light another cigarette, so she stared out the window as they approached Sandwich. She could see the boys reflected in the wing mirror. Shadows rested there, and although they were not so dark as anxiety, the day would be ruined if her stubbornness persisted. She patted her husband's arm. It's a good policy. Her smile lingered over him, and she sighed. Of course, it dates back to Jack Kennedy. When Tom failed to respond, she added, It's not like Nixon initiated it. He's just, following through. Tom nodded and took the pressure off the accelerator. Never said he did. He turned and stared at her. I know he's a slime. Nancy laughed at the term, and the boys joined in as Sammy growled at stray cats, squirrels, and other dogs. Nancy laughed. Just think, she turned around and smiled at the boys. If Uncle Perry hadn't left the barn door open, Gertie might have popped out a brood of tiny little snobs. The boys giggled at the idea of Sammy being a tiny little anything, let alone a snob. Todd budged closer to the dog and hugged the huge animal. The Dane responded by baying as if the moon had eclipsed the sun and drawn out his ancient canine heritage. Tom accelerated around a bend as the fair lane approached Sandwich. The sign marking the town line stood on a patch of dry ground. The iron post had been drilled into a granite boulder, around which oaks and pines towered over an acre of swampland, framed by a thicket of cat-o'-nine-tails. Do you know what those are? Nancy asked. Ninetails, Pete said. Yes, cat-o'-nine-tails, Nancy sighed. Also a name used for bullwhips. The Puritans liked those. She turned around to confront her husband, and their worried faces made no apparent impact on her. They'd flog anyone who didn't buy into their bullshit. Women, old men, even children on occasion. Right here on the Old King's Road. Highway, Tom said. The Old King's Highway, otherwise known as Route 6 or whatever the hell the Indians called it. Tom reached for a pack of Marlboros and tapped one out. He put the filter between his lips and lit the paper from the car's lighter, huffed in a plume of smoke, and handed it to Nancy. How about we do Sagamore for breakfast? Tom parked the car in the shade and rolled a window down so the dog could stick his head out. He put a bowl of water on the back seat and promised they'd be back in half an hour. They crossed the parking lot and the dog howled for them. Now you behave, Nancy warned. Curl up on that back seat and be a good boy. Sammy never could resist Nancy's commands. The family watched as he ducked down onto the back seat as instructed. They waited a moment, and when they heard him huff against the upholstery, they went into the restaurant and were promptly seated. Conversation did not seem appropriate given the niceness of the place. Nancy said the Sagamore was as snobby as a purebred pup. She preferred Dairy Queen or one of the little cafes whose reputation was spread by word of mouth, rather than a double-page advertisement in the Boston Globe. The coffee was good, though, and the waitress paid special attention to the boys. They were on their best behavior, and the girl whose name tag read Carol complimented Nancy on their good manners. "Look how they hold their knives and forks," she exclaimed. She must have been an exchange student. Her accent was British, although Tom and Nancy were unsure which part of the country she came from. The look of astonishment on Carol's face seemed genuine enough. "Like proper little gentlemen," Nancy sighed. "They're heathens." Carol poured the boys more orange juice and said, "I bet they are." As the boys polished off their waffles with syrup and butter, Nancy Alden shared a cigarette and a smile with her husband. Todd looked at them and noted the pride they exchanged. His heart welled up in his chest, and he felt like saying he was the happiest boy in the world. Of course, he did no such thing. When Carol came back with the check, Tom asked what part of England she was from. "My wife's a Brit, you know." "Oh, really?" Carol asked. "I was born here," Nancy sighed, "but our whole family moved to Plymouth when I was just a few months old." "Like a regular pilgrim," Carol said. "I'm no goddamn Puritan," Nancy said. After a moment, she seemed to reflect on the severity of her tone. "So, where are you from, Carol?" "Nowhere special. London, well, Haringey, actually. Got a bursary and decided to study here for a spell. I'm at Harvard." Nancy drew in her chin reflexively, and they were soon running down the steps to the parking lot. Sammy barked the second he saw them. He drooled on the window, and his tail thrashed the driver's seat. "Like a bullwhip," Todd thought. He ran toward the car, but Nancy grabbed his arm. "You want to get run over?" she growled. "Be more goddamn careful and hold Mummy's hand." Her anxiety waned, and she smiled. "Like a proper little gentleman." Pete laughed and tickled his brother. Nothing could make the day seem less perfect. Todd reveled in it, the way his father had lit up when the Apollo rocket blasted off. "Beaches and rockets and bears," he sang. This delighted his parents, and they swung him as Sammy growled and whined. Todd swayed back and forth over the tarmac and kicked the sea breeze. The salty air tasted of fish scales and kelp. It was peppered with sand and swirled in eddies across the parking lot. Tom drove further along Route 6 to Sandy Neck Drive, a stretch of road skirted by the great marshes. There were several cars parked along the dunes. Angry terns swooped over dry grass, dived at the intruders, and left splashes of white on windshields, hoods, and trunks. Tom slotted one quarter after another into a meter and exclaimed, "Ouch!" with each touch of hot metal. Todd enjoyed his father's antics and held his mother's hand until the meter was full. The sun held a dominant position on the horizon. It glared at them across still blue water and burned their foreheads and shoulders. Tom retrieved a stick from a tuft of beach grass. He handed it to his eldest boy and watched Sammy tilt his head and whine at the prospect of the chase. Before they abandoned the car, Nancy greased the boys with sunblock and placed baseball caps on their heads. Pete was especially pale and susceptible to blisters. The previous summer he had stayed up all night whimpering as his skin bubbled. The sight of the pristine beach sent all other thoughts crashing like the timbers of an unstable church. Todd jumped up and down in his swimming trunks and sandals. He was light and free as he toppled and lunged through the sand toward the shore.
His father took his hand, but he wriggled free, distracted by a gull's feather where it fluttered over the beach. Pete threw the stick and laughed as Sammy barreled through dunes and churned up a storm. The dog's growl and constant pant kept time with his elegant maneuvers. It was a dance which each partner knew intimately and reveled in. The power exerted by the Dane's muscular body was curtailed as delicately as a ballerina's whenever he came too close to one of the boys. Nancy tied a straw hat to her head with a scarf and put on a pair of sunglasses. She looked up at the sun, no doubt wondering what the astronauts saw when they gazed through the portal of their capsule. The dog trotted back with a stick in its mouth. A wake of white sand hung in the air behind him. Sammy growled, dropped the stick in front of Pete, and waited for the boy to pick it up. The huge animal hunched forward on his high legs, and his body shuddered and flexed. The animal's delight brought Nancy back to the moment with a smile. You know, I always remember what Alice said about Perry when I look at that dog. Tom peeled back the tab on a bud and straightened the backpack on his shoulders. What's that? You remember how she said he slips off to the ancestors. Perry's always been off with the fairies. Even when we were kids, he was never really with it. I suppose so, Nancy smiled. And I guess he's, lost. Todd held on to his feather and listened to his parents. When they saw him stood there with his befuddled face, they laughed and chased after him. The smell of suntan lotion and cigarette smoke was caressed by a salted breeze. The family walked along the beach for half an hour. Couple after couple sizzled in the hot sun. They lounged on bright beach towels or chairs as they shut their eyes against the god of the Incas, Aztecs, and Apaches. One woman in her 40s reminded Todd of the roast beef his mother served a couple of weekends before. Her legs were as dark as walnut veneer, and her perspiration trickled like dripping. The further they strayed into the Terns territory, the more deserted the beach became. A woman in her 30s sat on a blanket. Her husband busied himself with a beach umbrella. The damned thing would not stand up, and his wife and her poodle scowled at him. A tern suddenly swooped down and knocked her platinum wig free. A stray breeze dragged it further along the beach, where it was pursued closely by the poodle. The animal mistook it for one of its own and proceeded to mount it. "Oh, Mr. Whiffles!" the woman screamed. Nancy and Tom shielded their eyes and laughed. "That's a nesting ground," Nancy called, but the bewigged wife was too distracted by the poodle's ardor to respond. Todd walked on until he could no longer hear Tom and Nancy's laughter. On his periphery, a blue light flickered where the tide washed up onto the beach. The plume had been caught between two pebbles, and a light breeze made it flutter. The waves rolled in and threatened to claim the prize, so he charged forward to collect it. He stood there, mesmerized by the sun where it passed through the feather. It shined through the vein and downy barbs to a world of mystery and imagination. Todd must have been in a trance, because when he looked around there was no sign of his family. The sun beat down on his uncovered shoulders, and he was thirsty. His mother had the plastic cup he liked, the one with a picture of Captain Kangaroo. It had a spout, and she kept it filled with Kool-Aid. Something ached in his chest, and he ran to the right. He'd only gone a few steps when he stopped, worried he had gone the wrong way. He could not remember which end of the beach they had entered or the direction they had taken as they set off. The beach was white, and no stretch seemed more particular than another. The same sea rolled up onto it and hissed where it mocked him. There were no people on beach towels here, and there were none ahead or behind him. Angry terns with red beaks clicked and screeched warnings over the dunes. They dived at him and drove him further along the shore. His feet pattered through the wake as he hurried toward what sounded like people laughing. Somewhere ahead there must be other families. He ran and kept on running, but there was no one. He was hot and his mouth was parched, so he slowed down and plodded along. If it had occurred to him to cry, he might have been unable to stop. The situation was strange, and he could not recall ever having been alone like this before. He kicked the sand, and for a moment he was delighted by his isolation. Then he thought about Sammy, and had he not kept on walking, he would have cried and never stopped until they were reunited. Instead, he looked out over the incoming tide and plonked down on the beach. Sand quickly coated his uncovered legs and stuck to the backside of his trunks. The sun was higher in the sky, and he remembered his dad explaining how you could tell the time by it. Of course, he could not remember much more than it was lunchtime when the sun was straight up in the air. He wondered how far he had walked and recalled how nice the water felt when he waded through it. As if in answer, the sea rolled over his toes and splashed his legs. He shielded his eyes and watched shadows where they blinked open and shut, as if the ocean were an alien being. His mom said the Atlantic was alive and all oceans were ultimately one. So this living thing lived all around them and must be huge. He couldn't remember what she said other than something about the world being one giant living thing. They were just part of it, and the Indians were right to believe it was a whole. Todd never really understood what his mother meant. He was sad when he thought he might never see her again and wouldn't be able to ask her to tell him the story of life. And there life was, playing with his toes and rolling its eyes at him.
What am I supposed to do?
He looked out over the waves and could just make out what he thought was a sail. He shielded his eyes and squinted. Yes, there was a white triangle on the horizon. It moved slow like a shark with a full belly. He stood up and decided he should follow it along the shore until he could no longer keep up. As he took his first few steps, an angry tern dive-bombed him. It screeched and clicked as sharp wings flapped. Todd tried to scare it off, but he was more frightened than the bird would ever be. He started to cry, and before he knew what he was doing, he had run 100 yards along the beach. The bird only relented when he waded out into the sea. The ocean was not the only living thing, but he thought it was kinder than the sky. Horseflies buzzed around him, so he stayed out in the water for longer. The tide roared and crashed into him. It knocked him over and dragged him backwards, so he had to clamber back onto the beach.
"What'd I ever do to you?" he cried.
The sand was hot, and his sandals did not always protect his feet. The horseflies and terns were no longer harassing him, though, so he plodded further on. He walked a long way before he caught the scent of hamburgers and hot dogs. It drifted toward him, and he saw bundles of color he recognized as people. He toddled on and shielded his eyes from the sun. He was unsure of what lay sprawled before him. If his parents could abandon him, then anything was possible, and those heaps of color might be nothing but towels blown from a washing line. Todd started to cry when he thought of Sammy. The dog had chosen him, just as Nancy said. He was Todd's protector, and now nothing could save him from the ghosts his mother said wept along the Massachusetts shoreline, the spirits of Wampanoags, Narragansetts, Quakers, and escaped slaves. The bundles ahead became more distinct. They separated themselves from the spirits, and Todd believed they might be real. They were not just pictures in his mind, the kind of things his mother said dreams were made of. They were people. He could see some of them standing while others lay on towels or reclined on beach chairs. A crowd of teenagers sat around a cooler and an hibachi grill. Tiny hurricanes of whipped-up meat smoke rolled over the beach, and a young woman stood and shielded her eyes. She waved and called to him.
"Aren't you a little young to be out here on your own?"
Todd slowed his pace, and there was an ache in his chest. She smiled at him.
"You thirsty?"
She was a teenager with a pretty face and long brown hair. She looked over the rim of her sunglasses, and this gesture made her seem older and kinder. Todd nodded, and she beckoned for him to join them. He had lost his cap, so Anita put her boyfriend's hat on his head. Mike was a nice-looking guy. He stood there grinning at Todd with a Miller dripping the length of his arm.
"He looks hungry," Mike said.
Todd was hungrier than Jesus in the desert, and he told them so. His father used the expression, even though it made Nancy angry. He recalled the friction of it, how it worked them apart in defiance of their love. He must have looked lost because the teenagers grouped together, laughed, and patted his head or ruffled his hair. They made him a burger and asked where his family were. When he explained, Anita looked worried.
"Oh, they'll think he's gone in the ocean and drowned."
Mike's face darkened, and he ran further up the beach. Todd couldn't understand why her boyfriend had run away when Anita seemed so worried. The child must have looked concerned, so she sat beside him and promised it would be okay.
They huddled together while he drank Kool-Aid and ate a hot dog. When he was asked if he liked mustard, he said, "Uh-huh," even though he knew he didn't. The teenagers were in good spirits and happy to play games with him. They asked questions about the feathers he collected and why he preferred Wampanoags to Mohawks. If he had to stay with this new family forever, he figured he would be just fine. He didn't want to be left on a beach like a homeless ghost. Mike came back and waved to the others as he approached. His handsome face was marred by a stupid grin. When Anita saw him, she brightened, and her expression revved up and became something lean and earnest. "Beach Patrol found his folks," Mike called. Todd stood and shielded his eyes against the glare. Over an horizon bent and twisted with heat haze, an object approached. It wove through the buckled air like a buffalo upon a plain, and thundered forward, every bit as mysterious as Wankantanka, the great spirit of the sea and sky. It took several minutes for the sound of the Land Rover's engines to resonate over the sand. A man held onto a roll bar, and his shirt flapped in the wind. Todd knew those legs, those shoulders, shorts, and shirt. It was his father. He ran along the beach as the driver slowed the jeep. Tom Alden's face was worn out and creased with worry. He leapt off the Rover and charged forward, collapsed on his knees, and wrapped his son in his arms. They tumbled into one another the way a breaker rolls onto an open shore. Todd hung onto Tom's shoulders and would not let go. It was important to hold on and not get lost again, to wander off the way Uncle Perry so often did. He must hang on and find his way back along the old King's Highway to Nancy, Pete, and his faithful friend Sammy. Tom picked Todd up, ran his forearm across his face, and thanked Anita and Mike. They assured him it had been their pleasure. Todd saw none of this where his face was hidden by his father's chest. When the jeep started to motor back over the beach, Tom placed Todd on his lap and studied him. The ride was not as smooth as driving on the freeway, but Todd would drive anywhere with his father. The old man had stopped crying, but his eyes remained wet and glassy. "I followed your footprints," he said. "Followed them out into the ocean, and I couldn't find any more. They just disappeared." He kissed Tom's palm as if he were back on the section of beach where the tide washed over his hopes and dreams. "Your mother," Tom said. "She went out of her mind." The jeep came to a stop, and there Nancy stood, straw hat in hand. She looked mad, like she would remain angry for a good long time. Her silk scarf fluttered in the breeze and wrapped itself around her wrist. Todd climbed out of the Land Rover and stood there as the tension hovered. She fell to her knees and stretched out her arms. His heart cried, and he ran across the beach. He lost his sandals in the dash, but didn't care when the hot sand burned his soles. He charged into her and let her arms smother him as she held on to him and wept. "Don't you ever frighten me like that again," she whispered. There was a harshness to her voice, a tone he welcomed. She pressed her lips to his cheek and kissed him hard, as if to impress upon him the permanence of their connection. Nancy held Todd at arm's length and studied him, her scrutiny as relentless as the sun. She held him there until she was sure he was in one piece. "I love you a little more every day," she smiled, wiped away a tear, and ruffled his hair. "Do you understand that?" "Yes, Mommy." "I love you more than toast and honey, and if anything—" She could not continue, and in truth it was not necessary. Tom had slung an arm around Pete's shoulders. The older boy must have been shaken by the events of the day. Sammy clawed at the beach and whined so pitifully, Todd thought his heart would burst. He felt his mother's hand on his shoulders and allowed her to direct him back along the beach toward the car. They were together again, and nothing else mattered. Men could travel to the moon, but there was no greater miracle than having a family who loved you. He even had a dog who put all others to shame. The gentle beast pressed against Todd on the back seat of the car and huffed. When the boy wrapped his arms around the dog and pushed his face into the animal's fur, Sammy growled a reassuring rumble. Todd would always remember the moment of reunion. The glory of it would remain among the trenches of his mind, as distinct as wave patterns on a sandbar.
The following evening, the Aldens and their friends sat on a braided rug in front of a black and white TV set. The boys were allowed to stay up past bedtime to witness the lunar landing. Todd lay with his head propped up against Sammy as if the dog were a living bolster pillow. The extraordinary images and the gravity of the moment were eroded in his memory over time, but the sound of Anita's voice, the taste of hot dogs with mustard, and the way his father held him remained prescient and alive. The image of Tom Alden clinging to a roll bar perhaps became further distorted in memory than it had been by the heat haze, but the intensity of the moment never diminished. With everything the world was about to throw at him, this priceless gift would enable Todd to face the worst of it and survive. The thought of Todd being lost had done something terrible and beautiful to his father. The ever stoic, ever placid Tom Alden had all but lost his mind, and only regained it when they found each other on Sandy Neck Beach. The thought of his father's distress would break and heal Todd's heart over and over until the day he died. It would break on the shore of his being like the tides of time, propelled by some unknowable spirit that lies out in the sea.